Hello Charleston, this is Matt Olson, Environmental Education Coordinator with the City of Charleston. I'm joined by a couple of my co-workers down here at Tiedemann Park. And we have decided that since a lot of people are spending a lot more time at home, we figured you would be cooking at home a lot more often. And therefore you might have some extraneous vegetable pieces. You may have some leftover pasta, you may have some stale bread. And so what we wanted to do today is to kind of teach you all how to make your own compost bin at the house. We are here at Tiedemann Park. If you've never been to Tiedemann Park, we're located at 38 Elizabeth Street. I'll just give you a quick pan here of the area. And we're coming around, we have some swing sets in the back, a little hardcourt area with a board. Most people use that to knock tennis balls off. Sometimes people come down and kick soccer balls off of it. We are not a very large park here because we're in the middle of downtown Charleston. But as we swing around here, we got the road, the fence line, and then our building in the back. And then here are my two co-workers who will be here to help us out with our compost bin. All right, Charleston, so we are ready to start building this compost bin. Again, this is a super easy one that anyone should be able to do. What we did is we went out and we purchased a kind of a plastic storage bin. I don't know what size this one is, but we can find that out for you. I'm sure it's written down there. We're also going to do some peat moss, some topsoil, and then we have some shredded paper that we are also going to add to it. Now, as we go through this, I'll kind of explain the purpose of these ingredients that we're going to be adding. So we are going to go ahead and get started here. Dylan is going to be our official scooper, and he is going to first add some peat moss. He's going to add a substantial amount, maybe filling the bucket about a quarter of the way to maybe a third of the way. Let me get out of the way here. I don't know if we can see down here with the way the sun is angling down. We do have some dust flying around too from the peat moss. But we are adding the peat moss is kind of the main component for our bin to get it started. It is a very organic matter, and the worms will actually use that along with the items that you add, like the fruits and vegetables, and they will actually turn this peat moss into compost too. We've got a pretty good layer in there. The next thing we're going to add is actually some of this topsoil. This is just basic topsoil. It doesn't really have anything added to it. The purpose of the topsoil, the worms will also go through that and process it, but that gives them some grit as part of this compost bin. And the worms need that grit. They take it in and they will actually store it inside their body, and that's what helps break the food down. If they don't have anything gritty inside of their body, they're not able to process the material they take in nearly as well. So adding the topsoil is pretty important. You don't have to put as much topsoil in as the peat moss, or if you're using the coconut coir, but you definitely want enough in there to allow those worms to process. What we're going to add next is we're going to actually put just some shredded newspaper in there next. Now, the shredded newspaper is just some additional bedding. Again, the worms will go through and compost it, but the worms definitely want the bedding. As you probably know, worms really enjoy having a dark area. And so by adding these newspaper shavings, that will add an extra layer of bedding, which they definitely prefer to have in these compost bins. As you've probably noticed, this might be kind of dry. We are definitely going to add some water to this. And the reason we're going to add the water is, of course, the worms like the moist soil. If they don't have the moisture around them, they will dry up and die. So we obviously do not want that. So we are going to add a little bit of water to this. Now we're going to actually add water out of a hose, and we are not going to add the worms immediately to this bin, because we're going to want the water to actually sit out for a little while. The water does have chlorine in it, and of course the chlorine could cause some issues with the worms. So we'll put some moisture in this by adding the water. I will come back once we start adding that, and so you can kind of see how much. You do not want the soil to be soaking wet. Most people will say you want the soil to be the consistency of a damp sponge. Now, one other thing that we actually did before we even started filming this today is we did add some holes, some air holes to this. We just used a drill. We did not put holes in the bottom of the bin. Most of the videos that you're going to see, people put holes in the bottom of the bin. That is obviously there so that if an excess amount of water, if you're keeping this outside and an excess amount of water gets in there, it has a place to drain. You don't want to drown your worms. But if these are kept properly, you shouldn't need to use those. Okay. And so he's going to go ahead and start misting this paper that's down inside of the bin. Add a little bit of moisture to it. Keep going, Dylan. You're good. Keep going. Keep going. And this paper, he can get fairly damp right here. All that soil below it's pretty dry, so this moisture will definitely go down inside of it. We'll probably have to add some more water once everything gets mixed, but you kind of want to spread everything out. You want to get that peat moss, you want to get that topsoil, and you want to get the paper all mixed around. It's got that pretty mixed up. Let's add a little bit more water, because we do want it to have that kind of damp consistency. It looks like a lot of that soil is still pretty dry. And this is just a process here. You don't want to unload a whole bunch of water into the tank or into the bin all at once, because you don't want it to get too wet. So it's just kind of, you add a little bit, you mix it up. If it still feels pretty dry, then you're going to go ahead and add some more. What are we thinking, Dylan?
I think we're adding more.
More water. Now, as you're going along, as far as adding food, we showed you the, come back up here, our #compost life poster, some things that you can put into your bin, some other things that you shouldn't. So what you don't want to do also is you don't want to go and overload the bin with food. The worms can only eat so much before things will start to rot. Definitely some things that you do not want to add to this compost bin. Yeah, please don't put anything dairy in, anything meat related, no plastic, that should go in the recycling bin, and anything really smelly. Really, if you are properly maintaining this compost bin, it should not have a smell to it. So if it does have a smell that is not from the compost, that's actually from stuff that's been put in there that's rotting, and the dairy and the meat and fish and things like that, that's what's going to really start to rot in there. So you want to keep with the vegetables, the fruit, eggshells, even paper. If you have a toilet paper tube, which I know toilet paper is a hot commodity right now, you can go ahead and put that in. Now, any paper products you should moisten beforehand, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. This is kind of where we left it off last week. We had added the peat moss. Remember, you can also use the coconut core if you can find that. We added some topsoil for the grit. We also added some of the shredded paper just as bedding to help keep the moisture level consistent within this bin. Remember, these worms are going to need the moisture in order to survive. If they get too dry, they will be unable to breathe and will die and end up turning your bin into a smelly mess, basically. So you want to make sure that the moisture content is good. This still has a damp feel to it. Remember, we were going after the kind of damp sponge, not soaking wet, kind of like after you take a sponge and you wring all the loose water out of it, that kind of damp feel. So really when you add your worms, you can just kind of clear out one side. You can either use your hand. I've already put a few of the worms in here, and let's see, I thought that was one, but it wasn't. So you might see some wiggling around in here as we clear this out. So you want to make a little pit on one side. If you don't want to use your hands, you can use a tool if you have that, a little gardening tool, just to kind of clear out one side. So the worms we're actually going to be using are just red worms. You can find them in any bait shop. Even Walmart sells them. So it's these red worms. They are not night crawlers. The red worms tend to be a little bit smaller than the night crawlers, but in general, most people use red worms when composting. Kind of an interesting fact too, if you ever hear someone talking about composting with worms, it's actually called vermicomposting, and that signifies a type of composting just done with live worms. So we're going to crack this open here, and we have our bedding in there. Each one of these containers here came with, I don't know, I estimated probably about 20 to 25 worms. So here's a few of them right here. See if I can get them up close to y'all. Moving around. Yeah, I'm sure they're going to be excited to get down here into this bin and begin composting for us. So I'm going to go ahead and put these guys right down in here, and then I'm just going to take the rest of the bin and dump the rest of those worms in. And remember, I had already added a few worms to this previously, and so all in all I put 2 containers in, so we probably have about 45 to 50 worms that will be inhabiting our compost bin here. Worms like the darkness, so we're going to go ahead and just cover them up with the soil. Okay, make them nice and happy in there. Now, what most people do after they add their worms, they usually wait a couple days to start adding actual food scraps to their compost bin. That's just to let the worms get acclimated. When you do add your food scraps, so you're going to kind of want to do that same thing when adding to them. So you're going to want to pick one side, and you're going to want to clear out that opening, and then put your food scraps in, and then cover the food scraps back up. Now, when you go back to add your second batch of food scraps, I don't know, maybe a week later, you're going to want to go to the opposite side of the container. So you kind of bounce back and forth on which side that you're adding your food scraps. Now, remember, we don't want to overfeed these worms. You don't want to go and just dump so much food in here that it fills all the way up to the top here. That's going to be too much food for the amount of worms in here. These red worms can eat about half of their own weight every day in food. So if you estimate that you add a pound of worms, if you happen to have a bigger container and you added a pound of worms, those worms would be able to go through about a half a pound of food each day. So you're going to want to kind of keep that in mind too. For a smaller bin like this, you're not going to want to add a whole bunch. 50 red worms do not weigh very much. So you're going to want to start out slow. And then remember, those worms are also going to start using your bin as a breeding ground too. So over time, you should start to develop more and more worms. Very simple plan here, but kind of a cool activity, especially if people are cooking at home more and have more food scraps. Remember back to when we were initially building this, the do's and don'ts on what to put into your container. That's very important to follow. So, but this is a pretty simple idea. It helps the environment. It helps the landfills by reducing the amount of waste that goes into the landfills. And it's just kind of a good thing. Now, as these worms go through, it's not going to be immediate. After a couple months, after they've composted a lot of stuff, you're going to notice your soil's going to start to turn a little bit more of a black color. I know this looks black right now, but this is kind of a brown and organic thing. But once your soil starts to change into that kind of real fine black material. That's actually the worm poop, basically. A lot of people that do composting actually call that black gold. And that is what you can then add to your gardens or your flower beds in order to make that soil extremely nutrient rich. Really, it's the best type of fertilizer you can put into a garden. So I hope that you all are able to do this activity. I hope you have fun with it. I hope everyone's staying safe. I know things are changing day by day, but hopefully this is a little activity that you can go out and do with your kids, do with your parents, okay? While still kind of keeping that social distancing going on to knock back this virus. So hope everyone has a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.